All right, folks, happy Thursday. Hope that this finds you well and you're safe and you're happy and healthy as per usual. I just wanted to, again, kind of like introduce and walk through some of the topics for today. And again, we're kind of continuing here, with these topics of identity and metaphysics. So on Tuesday, we talked about kind of the scope of both fields and how they both relate, right? Of thinking about the nature of metaphysics and identity, and the idea that when we think about the ultimate nature of reality and we think about kind of, how we examine the world within which we live, undoubtedly we're going to have those questions as it relates and exists to identity, right? And we saw that in the example of thinking, I am not the same as I was when I was 3 years old. Okay? Like, I don't want to have a memory of being 3. I'm very different than I was when I was 3 years old, physically, intellectually, experientially, right? I've had a lot of differing experiences since I was 3. And they're really, there's so many differing things that exist between 3-year-old self and Bryce now that, am I really the same person? Am I the same person? Okay? And obviously our answer is, maybe it's not obvious, but probably our answer is no. But yet, we still want to probably claim some sort of consistency. So that's where we're at, and that's part of the questioning here, right? I'm thinking about and being curious about this idea of how do things stay the same yet be in constant change, both perhaps as it relates to the grand conception here of just thinking about how things stay the same yet be in constant change, and we've been talking about that in terms of our identities, but also thinking about that in terms of reality. How is it the case that so much has happened in human history, but yet there have been some things that have maintained? Right? Whether those things that have maintained have been thematic, maybe they've been reflective of innate instances of personhood, of what we do as human beings, of humanity, or maybe just everything's always in constant flux, right? So we dive into these kind of very pointed, kind of metaphysical and identity-related conversations. And then we can kind of tease this out even more as it relates to the nature of consciousness, right? And I'm not going to be any sort of, again, authority here on the nature of consciousness, for it spans such vast philosophical, psychological, biological literature. But what does it mean to be a conscious being? Okay, what does it mean to be, aware of oneself and aware of the world around us? And then thinking about, what are the various levels of consciousness? Right? We think of altered consciousness. We think of states of consciousness, sometimes by the influence of drugs or alcohol or even coffee, caffeine, right? So when we think about consciousness and conscious experience, right, then we're in a whole new host of conversations, okay? But they still circle back to metaphysics and identity. And so in thinking about this idea of what are we conscious of? What can we be conscious of? What counts as being kind of consciously aware of X, whatever X might be? And that's where we're at, right? That's what we're thinking about right now. And that's where we're going to go next week, especially with the nature of the film Inception, which I'm sure some of you have seen and some of you haven't, okay? And so if we have the conscious self, well, what about the subconscious self, right? Of that which definitely influences who it is we are, and who it is we think we are, and yet we're not aware of. Right? And again, this kind of goes into so many other conversations about the status of the mind, of like what the mind is capable of, the power of the mind. And then this leads us to think about dreaming, right? So like, what are dreams? What's the significance of dreams? You know, what might be the significance of remembering certain dreams, of not remembering certain dreams, of having reoccurring dreams, of the fact that we might be in a dream that we can't wake up from, okay? So there's a lot going on here, okay? There's a lot going on here. And as we, again, kind of orient ourselves to these kind of discussions, and as we orient ourselves to these kind of topics, we can find a whole variety of films that connect to them. And especially even considering the focus on the nature of time, like how do we measure time? Like that's both metaphysical, that also might relate to identity, that also might relate to like, do we have a conscious experience of time? Like what if we're sleeping, right? And you know, we obviously try to sleep, I don't know, probably some of you sleep 3 hours a night, but I'm just going to say we all try to sleep probably anywhere between 5 and 8 hours of sleep, right, on a good night. Maybe we dream, maybe we're transported to another world because the power of the mind is so frankly amazing at times. And in that, right, like in that space though, are we really aware of time passing? Because we're not like consciously engaged in our world, like we're removed from it via sleep. So what's going on here, right? And how can we perhaps see some of these themes in various films? And again, there's no shortage. So the films that I have chosen for next week, that again, I'm sure some of you have seen, but are Inception, which is going to deal heavily with themes that we're talking about right now, and then another film called Arrival. And Arrival is going to be kind of the closest measure to a sci-fi film that we watched this semester, but it's also going to be kind of one of the best films I've seen that deals with kind of the philosophy of language. And when thinking about the power of the way that words construct reality. Because again, part of this like metaphysical conversation here is this nature of like, how do we communicate about it? How do we engage with it? And often we engage with it through words, through verbiage, through discussion, right? And so in thinking about that, right, there is again, a connection here between metaphysical conversations, questions on identity, questions on consciousness, questions on the subconscious, but also all being related to the philosophy of language. I think that's all I got. Okay. So I hope that these questions, I hope that these thoughts spur something in you to consider more deeply. And as you gear up for next week, and as you start to dive into the films for next week, you can see and recognize perhaps why those films were particularly chosen and how they relate to those particular themes. Good luck out there.